So I'm Stephen Loxton of the Becker Library, and I have the honor of welcoming all of you to our presentation tonight. So I'm going to start the evening today by telling you more about segregation here at our medical center, starting with this 1931 photograph of the medical campus. For those of you familiar with our campus, you know that today we have the Hudlin tennis courts and park at the south end of campus and not these baseball fields. The major east-west street that you see in this photograph, that's what we now call Barnes Jewish Plaza. You may recognize a few of the buildings in this photograph as they're still on campus today. That includes the medical school's north and south building that are currently on Euclid Avenue. Maternity Hospital and the McMillan building are still a part of campus today, as is the medical school's west building. What may not be quite as recognizable is this long series of buildings that was all Barnes Hospital. This area of campus is what we now call Barnes Jewish South. It's gone through major renovations, additions, demolitions, new construction since the time this photograph was taken. But in 1931, that's what Barnes Hospital looked like. For many years, Children's Hospital was located directly behind Barnes Hospital. Today, like Barnes, it has gone through a number of renovations and it has, in fact, moved several blocks further north along Kings Highway. Also not here on our campus today is the Washington University School of Nursing. So once again, our medical center in 1931, I'm going to come back to this photograph in just a minute and make a point, but I'm going to leave you in suspense for just a minute and show you an even older photograph of our medical center. This is what it looked like when everything was brand new. The nursing school, Children's Hospital, Barnes Hospital, the three medical school buildings, everything that you see in this medical center photograph was brand new. It was less than a year old at the time that this photograph was taken. You may have noticed that the School of Nursing got a substantial renovation just since from between 1915 and 1931. The same is true of the Barnes Hospital. Rand Johnson Surgical Wing was added. And then Maternity Hospital and McMillan Hospital were also added to campus shortly after this photograph was taken. But if you look right where that arrow is pointing, you can actually see something in this photograph. So something was there before Maternity and McMillan went there. We can take a closer look. And it's two little houses. This photograph was also taken in 1915. And just to orient yourself, that's Euclid Avenue on the right. Barnes Jewish Plaza is at the bottom. Barnes Hospital is on the left. The taller building in the back is the medical school buildings. And in 1915, the formal name for these two little houses was the Hospital for Colored Patients. So black citizens of St. Louis that sought out medical care at our brand new campus, they could receive care. However, they weren't admitted into the Barnes Hospital building proper. Instead, they were admitted into these two little houses that served as an inpatient medical ward for black patients. These two little houses were in use for about the first 10 years or so that our medical center, after it opened. They were removed in order to make way for Maternity Hospital and McMillan Hospital in the 1920s. But before that happened, the easternmost wing of Barnes Hospital in the basement was retrofitted to serve as the new ward for black patients. And for many years, that was known as the 0400 ward in Barnes Hospital. And our exhibit prominently features oral histories that speak about what the 0400 ward was like. When I say many years it was in use from the 1920s all the way into the 1960s. But the 0400 ward was not part of the original plan for our medical campus, and that's what I'm showing you today. So this was before anything was constructed, just a few months before construction began. This was the plan for campus in 1912. And it's actually very accurate, including all of the shaded portions, which pointed out areas for future construction. And so we're here in the Farrell Learning and Teaching Center. The two little houses were here, and that's where maternity and Macmillan would eventually go. The campus planners were right about the addition to the School of Nursing, but they did get this part wrong. Let's take a closer look. So in 1912, the plan for our medical center was to build an entirely separate building specifically for Black patients. And it was going to be a 3 to 5 story building, but this was never constructed. And the reason for that is right about the time that our medical campus was under construction and open to new patients, the city of St. Louis announced that it was going to establish City Hospital number 2, which was the segregated hospital for Black patients. And that opened in the 19-teens. I won't go too much into it, as I suspect Dr. Sanford's going to talk about that one. But I will say it was located nearby. It's at the present-day location of Harris-Stowe University. And perhaps now that Black citizens of St. Louis had a place to go, maybe our medical center administrators felt we didn't need to construct a building here on our campus, but instead the 0400 ward in Barnes would suffice, along with what I'm showing you here, which was the segregated ward and children's hospital that opened in 1923. This is one of only about 3 or 4 photographs that we have of the Butler ward. We have many, many images of our medical campus in the archives. I have not found one of the 0400 ward. Elsewhere on campus, in 1931, the Macmillan building opened. This was one of the 2 buildings that went in place of the 2 little houses. What I'm showing you here is a blueprint of the ground floor. It featured a kitchen as well as segregated dining rooms for campus employees. Also in the Macmillan building, it featured segregated bathrooms, and at the time, segregation was both on race and class. This blueprint is a particularly interesting piece to look at. If you'd like to take a closer look at it, it is in our reading room tonight next to the exhibit. So I am back at the 1931 aerial photograph of our medical center. And what I wanted to show you is not only was segregation here from the very beginning with those 2 little houses in 1915. Whenever maternity hospital was constructed, it included segregated floors for new and expecting mothers. The Macmillan building, that's what I just showed you with the blueprints with the segregated dining rooms, segregated bathrooms. The 0400 ward was here, again in use until the 1960s. The segregated ward at Children's Hospital was over here. We are right here in what would be an empty lot in this photograph, but this is the FLTC location today. And so my point is not only are these locations nearby, but also some of the buildings that were segregated are still here on campus. If you've ever walked through the main thoroughfare of Barnes U.S. Hospital, you would have walked right across the top of the 0400 ward. And so my hope is that our speaker tonight can provide some context to what I've just shown you. I think the very existence of the segregation policies that were in place beginning in 1915 reinforced segregation, reinforced inequality both on and off campus. Desegregation that our exhibit gets into was not an overnight process. It took a long time, and the ramifications from that we're still dealing with today. So I think the title of tonight's lecture is very aptly named, "When Disparities Remain, the Enduring Legacy of Segregated Medicine." So thanks to all of you for taking an hour or so out of your day to learn more about segregation on our campus, as well as elsewhere in St. Louis. I would now like to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Ezelle Sanford III. I met Ezelle a few years ago when he was doing research in the archives. He was a graduate of Washington University, and he was a John B. Aaron Scholar. He completed his PhD at Princeton University. He was a postdoctoral fellow in the program on race, science, and society at the University of Pennsylvania. He is now an assistant professor at Carnegie Mellon University, where he teaches courses in the history of American medicine and public health, as well as African American history. Dr. Sanford is currently working on a book titled Segregated Medicine: How Racial Politics Shaped American Healthcare. The lecture is going to be about an hour long, and then we will have time for questions for those of you here in person. We do have a microphone. If you could use that, the folks on Zoom can hear you. We will answer questions via Zoom as well. If you want to use the Q&A feature, I will read off the questions for Dr. Sanford there. Again, please join us for the reception and the new exhibit opening on the 7th floor of the Becker Library after the talk. But for now, please join me in welcoming our 84th Historia Medica lecturer, Dr. Ezelle Sanford.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is indeed an honor to be here to share my work with you today. Thank you so much. And I want to give a special thank you to Stephen Logsden, who has not only helped me with my archival work and thinking about my project on Homer G. Phillips Hospital, but for he and his staff on putting together a wonderful exhibit on desegregation, and I think really participating in a larger moment as medical schools and medical students, staff, and medical education are beginning to think about the legacies of racial segregation in American medicine and public health. I also want to thank my colleague, Kenneth Ludmer, for putting my name into the hat to speak with you all today. And finally, I want to thank Dr. Wilbur Ross, who, even from my time as an undergraduate student, has been championing diversity, equity, and inclusion here at the medical school, and especially for his continuing emphasis on the legacy of Homer G. Phillips Hospital. I remember coming to the Homer G. Phillips Hospital lectures as an undergraduate student and learning more about this hospital. So it really is an honor to be here and to share my work with you today. So the title of my talk, as Stephen mentioned, is When Disparities Remain, the Enduring Legacy of Segregated Medicine. And this title is based upon a question that I've been asking myself since I was a student here, which is, why do racial health disparities continue to persist even after hospitals were desegregated in the 1960s and the 1960s and 1970s? And it was a question that I developed as an undergraduate student, as a John B. Irvin Scholar, when Bob Hansman took us on tours of the city and taught us about many of the different institutions and African Americans' contributions to the city, and showing us Homer G. Phillips Hospital. And the question, I began to think about this question also in courses that were instructed by Professors Shawande Mustaqim, Shanti Parikh, and Rafia Zafar, my dear, dear mentor. As I began to do undergraduate research as a Merle Kling Undergraduate Honors Fellow, working with Dr. Gerald Early and Wendy Love Anderson. And finally, in digging through the archives, working with folks like Stephen, Rudolph Clay at the Washington University Department of Special Collections, and Miranda Rechtenwald. And so I've spent much of my time from my undergraduate career to my time as a graduate student thinking about this hospital and thinking about the history of racial segregation in St. Louis. And this stayed with me until my doctoral dissertation, so I actually focused on the history of Homer G. Phillips for my history PhD. And I thought to myself, what better place then than Homer G. Phillips, right? The largest segregated black hospital in the United States, to sit in one place historically in order to trace the transition from racial segregation to desegregation in American healthcare. Now, Homer G. Phillips Hospital opened in 1937, and it closed in 1979. It was among the largest general hospitals in the United States at the mid-20th century. It was also a municipal hospital providing free care for poor or indigent African Americans. It was a teaching hospital that really elevated its reputation to the national level, where it trained about 1/3 of black physicians in the Jim Crow period. It provided internships and residencies in the medical specialties. And it also importantly trained nurses and other professionals, including medical records librarians and radiological technicians. And now my work is being translated into a book tentatively titled Segregated Medicine: How Racial Politics Shaped American Healthcare, which has been offered a contract to Columbia University Press in its Race, Health, and Inequality series. But I'm going to begin here. Some of you may be familiar with this new institution that's appeared in North St. Louis. And I've learned throughout my research that the memory and legacy of Homer G. Phillips Hospital is still evolving, even in the present day. And so imagine my surprise when I learned, as I followed the news, even from afar, as I've been traveling, that this new Homer G. Phillips Hospital was opening in North St. Louis on the former site of the Pruitt-Igoe housing complex. Now, Black St. Louisans have raised significant complaints, especially in the African-American newspaper, the St. Louis American. And they claim that the name Homer G. Phillips Hospital was stolen by Paul McKee, the man who has developed this new hospital or urgent care center. It's about 3 beds or so. And there's also a protest effort from some of the same individuals who mobilized in the 1970s, in the 1980s to save Homer G. Phillips Hospital. And they're protesting to ask Paul McKee to change the name of this institution. The Homer G. Phillips Hospital Nurse Alumni Association, Incorporated, is also engaging in a legal effort to get Paul McKee to change the name. And I have also written about this new institution in the historical magazine Informal History. But today I wanted to add another question into the mix. And that is, how does naming this hospital reflect the enduring legacy of racial segregation in medicine and public health today? And I spoke with activist Zenobia Thompson, who's been active in the Saturday morning protests to change the name of this hospital. And I was talking to her about it and giving her my analysis, which is that this is about the expansion of private healthcare facilities and medical entrepreneurism, which I often critique in my own work. But she told me this. She says that we will not say no to any healthcare institution that wants to place itself in North St. Louis because the need is so important. But she told me that people have to understand that Homer G. Phillips Hospital opened because of racism and it closed because of racism. Now, I've been thinking about how to articulate this, how to describe the history of Homer G. Phillips Hospital, to contextualize the ironies of this history of racial segregation that often pop up, and some of these ironies we're going to explore in a little bit. But she put this in the most succinct way that I just had to use her quote from this phone conversation. So my role as a historian of medicine here is to contextualize and explain how this could be possible, right? That Homer G. Phillips Hospital opens because of racism and it closed because of racism. And the history of racial segregation, as I said, is one of many ironies and contradictions that I'm going to explore with you all today as Black Americans negotiated the tricky terrain of racial segregation to assert health as a condition of their full citizenship in St. Louis and in the United States. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through the history of racial segregation using the case study of Homer G. Phillips Hospital. We're going to begin by exploring how care was segregated in St. Louis's public hospital system. We're going to explore segregation in medical education inside Homer G. Phillips. And I'm going to give you a brief overview of the medical civil rights movement at both the national level as well as the local level here in St. Louis. So section 1, segregating care. The pioneering scholar, historian Vanessa Northington Gamble, in her book, Making a Place for Ourselves, describes the Black hospital movement from 1920 to 1945. Now, in the early 20th century, hospitals became a destination for care, especially for many African Americans many Americans who could afford it. But because of Jim Crow racial policies, Black Americans were often segregated in hospitals. As Stephen described here, even at Barnes Hospital, they were at, let's see here, that's okay. They were admitted for care. They were treated in basement wards if they were admitted to hospitals at all. And these basement wards, these colored wards, often appeared in basements, attics, and auxiliary buildings where Black people were treated. And this often translated into inferior service and treatment. And here I have an image from the recent show, The Nick, that actually dramatizes this history of racial separation inside of hospitals. Now, as Vanessa Northington Gamble notes, Black Americans also engaged in their own projects to create their own network of hospitals to provide care and to train professionals. Okay. So the history of Black Americans establishing hospitals can be traced to Chicago in 1891. And here I have an image of Dr. Daniel Hill Williams, who is widely credited as performing the first open heart surgery. Now, he establishes Chicago's Provident Hospital following an episode with a nurse, Emma Reynolds, who was denied admission to a nurse training school because of her race. After a successful fundraising campaign, this successful fundraising campaign produced the first Black-operated hospital and training school for nurses. Now, I should emphasize that Black-serving hospitals often serve this dual purpose, right, of patient care and professional training, especially beginning with nurse training, as the oppressive regime of racial segregation grew in the early 20th century. Now, in St. Louis, there was also a Black hospital movement, that was not just by African Americans. There was a Black hospital named Provident Hospital, similar to Chicago's Provident Hospital, and Baltimore's Provident Hospital, established by the Provident Benevolent Association. And as I was just talking with an archivist from the Sisters of St. Mary, there was also a Catholic hospital that was dedicated to the care of African Americans. And St. Mary's Infirmary, which was that hospital, is often credited as being the first Catholic hospital to have that mission. And it's distinct from, at least from what I understand, it's distinct from St. Mary's Hospital of SSM Health. So, building on the work of historian Vanessa Northington Gamble and hospital administrator Nathaniel Wesley, I, along with undergraduate and graduate research assistants, are beginning to seriously investigate the history of Black-serving hospitals and map them. Right? So here is an incomplete version of a digital history project that I've started at Carnegie Mellon titled Mapping Segregated Medicine, which attempts to map the greater record of what Vanessa Gamble calls the Black hospital movement. And here we have about 170 institutions that Gamble herself has collected, of about 400 total Black-serving hospitals that were established in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Okay. So, in order for us to understand how Homer G. Phillips Hospital develops, I took a step back and away from medicine to actually think about racial segregation policies in the city of St. Louis. And as World War I loomed on the horizon, the search for economic opportunities and escape from Southern racial violence drove many Black Americans to migrate northward, often ending up or moving through St. Louis, Missouri. Now, from 1910 to 1920, St. Louis's population was increasing, and African Americans among them were increasing as well, the population nearly doubling. Now, already strained race relations were increasing in terms of their tension, and local St. Louisans began to organize a citizens' movement to pass ordinances that would protect the, quote, racial purity of St. Louis neighborhoods. And here we have an image that's also featured at the Missouri History Museum that is advocating that local St. Louisans vote no on this, on these ordinances. These ordinances were voted on by the people of St. Louis, which was distinct from the other kinds of racial segregation ordinances that were being passed in places like Baltimore. This movement begins in Baltimore in 1910. And this image is a political cartoon, again, advocating that folks vote no. You see an enslaved family that's running away from an enslaved master, or a slave master, right? You have Abraham Lincoln in the background with his House Divided speech. Now, ultimately, this political cartoon was unsuccessful because the two ordinances that were proposed as charter amendments here in St. Louis actually passed by popular vote. But these ordinances were deemed unenforceable in 1917 by the United States Supreme Court's Buchanan v. Worley decision. But these racial tensions reached a boiling point also in 1917, as there were tensions about race, but also labor, right? And across the Mississippi River in East St. Louis, white vigilantes began to attack Black residents, burned property, and left many people not only homeless, but also injured, if not dead. Now, estimates vary on how many individuals were actually killed, how many others that were left homeless. Some African Americans actually moved over to St. Louis. And the massacre is often referred to as a race riot. And scholars have since critiqued these formulations to really emphasize the racial terror that was caused by white vigilantes. So they've used terms like pogrom or massacre, for example. So both the 1916 segregation ordinances and the 1917 racial massacre, along with the emerging 1918 outbreak of the Spanish flu, which has often been cited as starting in Kansas City, were key events in the lead up to the city of St. Louis establishing healthcare services for the growing Black population. Dr. Howard Philip Venable, who is featured in the exhibit today and is a key figure in my research, who is a board-certified ophthalmologist and a key figure in the desegregation of Washington University, described the origins of municipal health care for African Americans in this way, quote, "The history of Homer G. Phillips Hospital is one of an idea which was born in the hearts of doctors and interested citizens early in 1914. And in the past 24 years, this idea has expanded, and the influence has been felt not only in St. Louis, in the St. Louis community, but all over the world. And here I want to emphasize that it's not just about patient care that establishes the movement for a new hospital for African Americans, but it's also the need for professional training. And I would wager, Stephen, that Black professionals, Black doctors, may have also been aware of the segregated facilities at Barnes Hospital in 1912, 1914. I think those dates are not coincidence. And the first institution that the city of St. Louis develops for African Americans is City Hospital number 2. The city of St. Louis purchased a more than 50-year-old building and converted it into a municipal hospital for black St. Louisans. Now, there was at least a debate between Dr. Venable and others about what this institution was. Was it the old Barnes Medical College, or was it the old Barnes Hospital? I tend to agree with folks who have asserted that it was, in fact, the old Barnes Medical College located on Lawton Boulevard. And Candace O'Connor also mentions this, and I agree with her in her work, Climbing the Ladder, Chasing the Dream. Now, this old hospital that's been converted into City Hospital number 2 was decrepit and crowded. Black St. Louis leaders condemned the hospital as a meager improvement to the overcrowded to the colored wards. Wow, or no hospital care at all. And so in 1929, the black newspaper, the African American newspaper, the St. Louis Argus, produced an editorial proclaiming, quote, "The crowded fake hospital at 2945 Lawton Boulevard is no longer a disgrace, but is an actual crime against civilization." And this is St. Louis Argus, 1929. Black activists like David Grant actually went inside of the hospital and took pictures. They took pictures inside of the monkey enclosure at the St. Louis Zoo and compared them. Both of these institutions were public institutions. They compared them, leading to this ultimate evaluation in the St. Louis Argus. And they began to mobilize to build a new hospital, which will become, again, Homer G. Phillips. So this is how public hospital care in St. Louis developed in the Jim Crow era, from segregated wards in City Hospital and Barnes Hospital to segregated hospital in an old building, City Hospital number 2, to the more than $3 million facility financed in part by Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal program. Now, this is exceptional because Black Americans, as the literature shows, were often excluded from the benefits of the New Deal. But because of the growth of the Black population here in St. Louis, who also could vote, first of all, and then made the transition from supporting the Republican Party to the Democratic Party, electing Bernard Dickman, this infusion of federal funds to the city's provided funds made this larger institution possible. And so with a parade of World War I veterans, the hospital opened on George Washington's birthday. And there were many dignitaries that attended this dedication ceremony, including Harold Ickes, the Secretary of the Interior. I believe from some of the documents that I've seen here at the Becker, that folks understood that Franklin Roosevelt would attend, but I think he sent his secretary instead, so the Secretary of the Interior, a cabinet member. The hospital opened in the Ville. It was locally accessible. And more importantly, it became a community institution. So it expanded beyond its health functions to really offer a variety of services and opportunities for community and gathering in North St. Louis. The institution was massive compared to many of the other Black hospitals that were created prior to this. It covered 2 city blocks. It had 600 beds at its opening. And the hospital, again, emerged as the largest Black hospital in the nation and stood amongst the largest general hospitals in America. Now, here we're getting to some of the ironies and contradictions of the history of racial segregation and hospital care. And I pulled a quote from the lawyer, civil rights, and labor activist David Grant. And he said this about Homer G. Phillips Hospital, quote, "And they built what I claimed was the biggest Jim Crow institution in the world, Homer G. Phillips Hospital. It may sound like I'm boasting, but I suggested that it be named Homer G. Phillips, and he was a lawyer, and Phillips' main thing had been to prevent them from building a ward at City Hospital number 1. Here is a case where you Even though you hated Jim Crow, you had to embrace it because he saw no opportunity for the development of black doctors, and he thought that the ward wing down there would be merely an experimental thing for the white doctors. And so he fought the thing. Now, this is important, right? Thinking again about segregated wards at Barnes Hospital, there was a proposal before City Hospital number 1 was built to actually build a colored annex to City Hospital number 1, much in the same vein as Barnes Hospital. And Homer G. Phillips and other black leaders actually petitioned the mayor to build a completely separate hospital. Now, City Hospital number 2 was again, meager concession, but they continued to fight until they secured these funds to establish Homer G. Phillips Hospital. But who was Homer G. Phillips? Who was Homer G. Phillips? He was absent. He was not present at the 1937 opening of the monument that became his namesake, right? He was actually publicly assassinated in 1931. He was widely credited as starting the movement to establish Homer G. Phillips Hospital. And here there's a significant irony because Homer G. Phillips fought against all forms of segregation. Even in terms of where he lived, he chose not to live where many other African Americans lived. He instead chose to live in a white neighborhood. And so this anti-segregationist lawyer becomes associated with a segregated institution, and that is Homer G. Phillips. And we begin to see the ironies and contradictions of those associations across the 20th century. Now, Phillips was born as John Wesley Phillips in Pettis County, and there he changed his name to from John Wesley, who was a Methodist minister who famously baptized enslaved people. And before he went to Howard University, he changed his name to Homer Garland Phillips, and he emerged as the only black lawyer from Pettis County. He became the well-known lawyer of Sedalia. And Phillips also ran an unsuccessful campaign for Congress in 1926 against Leonidas C. Dyer. He moved to St. Louis in 1911. And he also became a national figure in Republican politics. Now, here you see a bit of his program from his 1926 campaign that ultimately failed. And he emphasized the key issues of equal access to education and military services. Now, one of the questions that I've had about Homer G. Phillips, and I'm still not quite sure how to answer, is that even though he is widely credited as leading the movement to establish this new hospital for African Americans, we don't really see it in terms of his, again, platform here for Congress, or even in some of the other statements that he makes to the press in the early 20th century. And so we see in this movement to establish Homer G. Phillips Hospital for both the care of poor black St. Louisans and to train nurses and later physicians, how black Americans navigated the racial politics of the day to secure Homer G. Phillips Hospital as an important political and health concession. Okay, now moving on to segregation and medical education. So before the Black Hospital movement and following the collapse of congressional Reconstruction, black Americans established a system of black-serving medical schools, and black Americans, along with religious and philanthropic organizations, began to do just that. And here you see just a brief map of some of the major medical schools that offered medical training to African Americans in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. So medical education in the 19th century was highly varied. And so you may know about Meharry Medical College and Howard University. These are two of the most prominent institutions that still remain today. But there were others, including Leonard Medical College that was associated with Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina. It was one of the few four-year medical schools in the late 19th century. But that changes in 1910 as a reform effort in the early 20th century standardized the four-year medical curriculum along with clinical and laboratory instruction. And here I have to thank Kenneth Ludmer for his work in Time to Heal and helping me to understand how this process develops. And this reform effort was embodied in what is now called the Flexner Report. And Abraham Flexner was an educator, a reformer who attended Johns Hopkins University. And he was funded by the Carnegie Foundation to visit the numerous medical schools across the country. He even came here to Washington University, and there's a very interesting story about that that's been featured in some of the publications produced by Washington University. And so often black medical schools like Leonard struggled with funding, staffing, and facilities. And with the exceptions of Howard University and Meharry Medical College, the network of black medical schools collapsed by the 1920s. Now, here I should mention that since the Flexner Report, since the collapse of medical schools, there have been two new black-serving medical schools that have been established in the latter half of the 20th century. The first is Charles Drew, which was established in Los Angeles, and also with the efforts of Lewis Sullivan, the Morehouse School of Medicine was established. Now, by the 1920s, hospitals also became important for graduate medical education, as I'm sure you all are aware, as they provided internships, an additional year of rotating training in general hospitals, as well as residencies in the medical specialties. Now, because hospitals across the nation practice various forms of segregation, both at the professional level but also at the patient level, black Americans created opportunities for graduate medical education in segregated hospitals. And here you see 5 of the most prominent teaching hospitals that offered these training opportunities for African Americans, including Providence Hospital in Chicago that I previously mentioned, Freedman's Hospital in DC that was associated with Howard, Harlem Hospital in New York, Hubbard Hospital in Nashville, Tennessee, and of course, Homer G. Phillips Hospital. Let's take a So in 1937, as the hospital opens, to much fanfare locally, it also begins to emerge as an institution with national significance. In 1937, St. Louis hosted the annual meeting of the National Medical Association. The National Medical Association, which was formed in the 1890s, was an alternative to the American Medical Association, which began to exclude the few black members that it did have in the late 19th century, and so for black physicians. And the organization described the new Homer G. Phillips Hospital in this way. And remember, it's Homer G. Phillips compared to many of the other black-serving institutions that members of the NMA were used to is much, much larger, right? So many folks are looking at this with a tremendous amount of awe. And so Dr. John Kinney, writing to the members of the NMA to encourage them to come to the conference, said this: "Of course, the added attraction of the new Homer G. Phillips Hospital, costing over $3 million, with its well-trained staff, anxious to show us all the newest and best in scientific care of the sick, together with the well-trained staffs of the other 2 large hospitals and the professors of the medical colleges, all authorities in their lines, waiting to give you the best they know. We can well say that the medical millennium has been approached, and the convention will be one of the most successful in the history of the National Medical Association." And so the hospital developed as a prestigious center for graduate medical education, training, nearly 1/3 of all black physicians. And because of its size, Homer G. offered more positions for internships and residencies than any other black hospital. But yet, at this 1937 meeting, NMA leaders voiced concerns of the growing shortage of black medical trainees. The impact of Abraham Flexner's report in 1910 constrained the production of medical graduates, contributing to Black hospitals' staffing problems by the 1950s. Now, many who trained in the nursing and residency programs remember the hospital fondly. They have positive associations with this segregated institution. And scholars call this kind of gathering of sort of a response, inward-turning response to segregation as congregation. And I want you to listen to Dr. Bertha Carter Simmons, who trained as a nurse at Homer G. Phillips Hospital, and particularly the way that she describes the hospital as a mecca of minds. This is from an oral history that I did with her a few years ago. When I say Homer G. Phillips Hospital, what immediately comes to mind? Like, just first thoughts.
I think about a community, and I think of people who are working together, mostly Black, in an area that is basically a Black community where we're meeting the needs of our people. And probably if it was still there, it would have changed at this point, because I don't think it would be integrated. But at that time, when I think of it back when it was where it was, I think about that. And we really had some of the smartest people in the country right there. Yeah. Some of our physicians went to schools and learned so many different things. They would come in and show other physicians how to do it, different surgeries, and it was just a mecca of minds, where people were learning. It was just, I was so grateful just to have been there for real.
I may actually use that. I did use it. It's actually the title of one of my chapters. But it was a mecca of minds. And again, I want to emphasize again that there are these positive associations, right? And you can hear it in her voice as she describes it as a mecca of minds. I think also the term mecca is really important. When you think about Mecca, you think about pilgrimage, travel, right, to a sacred place. And that may be the way that folks began to see Homer G. Phillips as it develops its training programs in nursing, as well as in the specialties. I did want to include this document here that is taken from the records of Frank O. Richards here at the Becker that depicts the first entering class of residents to Homer G. Phillips Hospital. And so from 1940 to 1979, Homer G. trained more than 1,500, according to Frank Richards, 1,500 Black physicians, specialists, the most of any other institution in the United States. And among the residency programs, its 5-year surgical residency was perhaps the most prominent and prestigious, and it contributed to its later identification as a first-rate trauma center in North St. Louis in the Ville. Here we also see members of the Cadet Nurses Corps, right? So in the 1940s, in preparation for the war. And nurses were essential, essential to the hospital's operation, its health functions, but they also helped to integrate the community, right, and the hospital together. And so this is what I write about when I talk about the hospital as a community building community. The nurses really traversed the entire spectrum of the hospital's operation. I should also acknowledge that the high caliber of training was due in part to the involvement of the 2 St. Louis medical schools, especially Washington University in St. Louis. And here we have a picture on the left here, Evarts Graham, who became a significant player in helping to develop the surgical residency program at Homer G. Phillips Hospital. And later, Robert Ellman, who also helped to contribute to the surgical residency program's continued success at Homer G. And here we come to Dr. Helen Nash, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And so among those trained at Homer G. Phillips Hospital was Dr. Helen Nash, who was a pediatrician. And the documentary, The Color of Medicine, I think does a wonderful job of describing her career and innovations in pediatric care. And she brings a perspective not only about race and racial inequality, racial discrimination, but also about gender and the male-dominated profession, even amongst Black physicians, right? Dr. Nash often had a reputation of being feisty. I would contend, though, that living sort of at the intersection of these two identities as a Black woman, contributes to that kind of response, right, in order to be heard and taken seriously. But it's her relationship with Washington University pediatrician, Dr. Park White, that eases her path to helping her desegregate St. Louis Children's Hospital in the 1940s. Okay. Now, you may be wondering, what about the patient, right? The patient is often difficult for historians of medicine to access in the archive, but we do have some clues from documents, but also from some of the personal experiences of individuals who were treated at Homer G. Phillips Hospital. And so take, for instance, Nurse Zenobia Thompson, who we've heard from before at the beginning of this talk, who grew up not in the Ville, but in the greater Ville area, who described how she was able to access the hospital by simply walking there, right? So we're thinking about geographical proximity between the hospital and the community that it's serving, right? In St. Louis, is your family there?
Close to the Ville area. Not quite the Ville, but it will be called the Ville, where Homer G. Phillips Hospital. I mean, you could really say the Ville, because my mother would say many times that they walked to Homer G. Phillips. They did, they took me to Homer G. Phillips as a child because I wouldn't sleep at night or all kind of problems. But I grew up there.
Right, and this is what I hear from folks who grew up in the Ville, who knew about Homer G. Phillips Hospital, that they saw people walking, doctors walking to and from the institution, nurses that were going around to different churches on Sunday morning, right? So again, this facilitates the relationship, the communal relationship between the institution and the people that it served. Now, again, all of this sort of, outlines the positive associations with this institution that was, of course, the product of a segregated public health system, right? And so we cannot forget that there were others who did not have positive reflections of this institution. And here I pull on comedian Dick Gregory, who was a St. Louis native, born and raised in Kinloch. And he expresses the negative associations with racial segregation. And to him, the hospital represented his poverty, racism, and inequality in the city. And now, we're going to see later that his perspectives evolve over time, but he wrote in his 1964 autobiography the following, and I have it quoted here. I remember one time when a doctor in white walked up and said, "What's wrong with him?" as if he didn't believe anything was. Mama looked at me and looked at him and shook her head. "I sure don't know, doctor," but he cried all night long. He said, "It's something in his stomach. Bring him and get his clothes off." And I was so mad at the way that he was talking to my mama that I bit down too hard on the thermometer, and it broke in my mouth. The doctor slapped me across my face. "Both of you go ahead to the back of the line and wait your turn." My mama had to say, "I'm sorry, doctor," and go to the back of the line. Indeed, while Black hospitals offered opportunities for professional advancement, the patients contended with these larger social conditions produced by the history of racial segregation in medicine. And again, in his 1964 autobiography, Homer G. Phillips is actually quite prominent as a symbol, as a representation of his struggles in poverty. Okay, we're going to move on to the medical civil rights movement and thinking about hospital desegregation. And so while Helen Nash was an early leader in the emerging medical civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, Black physicians were beginning to target segregated hospitals, and even those that were established by Black Americans, as unfit for care. And this document, published in the 1950s, called The Untouchables, is a pamphlet that was produced by Albert Manuse and other civil rights organizations that collected and illustrated stories of hospital discrimination. And here I pulled out two pages that chronicle the 1931 death of the Dean of Women at Fisk University, Juliet Derricotte. She was traveling along with 3 other students in Dalton, Georgia, and was involved in a fatal collision where 2 students were injured, 1 student actually lost her life. Derricotte herself was also fatally injured. She wasn't allowed into the nearby hospital in Dalton, and she was taken instead to a Black-serving hospital in Chattanooga, Tennessee, 50 miles away. Now, it was reported that this hospital did not have sufficient X-ray technology to detect that she had possibly a pelvic fracture, and Derricotte ended up succumbing to her injuries in a few days. And this story really circulated not only nationally, it was written about by folks like Walter White and Roy Wilkins, but it also circulated internationally, right, as outsiders, including those who were involved in the Communist Party, began to point out the fatal perils of racial discrimination in the United States for African Americans. And so at the national level, figures like William Montague Cobb, who was the editor of the Journal of the National Medical Association and also a leader in the NAACP, began to initiate a movement to desegregate hospitals. He published a section in the Journal of the National Medical Association called the Integration Battlefront, where local physicians could write in and speak about how they themselves were engaging in the movement to desegregate hospitals. And in the 1960s, the JNMA became, or the National Medical Association became a key player in national politics in debates about Medicare and Medicaid. So while the major organizations of organized medicine, the American Medical Association, the National Hospital Association, did not support Medicare legislation, the NMA did, right? And W. Montague Cobb was the only representative of organized medicine to stand near Lyndon Baines Johnson as he signed the 1965 legislation. Now, we should note that in 1965, Medicare and Medicaid expanded access to care for all Americans, but it also changes the way that hospitals begins to change hospital financing. And it was also tied to hospital desegregation, right? So hospitals that did desegregate could get access to Medicare reimbursements, while those that did not, that were not in compliance with Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, could not get that funding. And on the right here, we have an image of Dr. George Simpkins, who was a North Carolina dentist, who incidentally stumbled into perhaps one of the most significant Supreme Court decisions that folks don't know about, which is Simpkins v. Moses Cone Hospital in 1963. Well, this was not a Supreme Court case. It actually rose to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. The Supreme Court refused to hear it. But it's still a significant case because it begins to put a chink in the overall system of racial segregation and hospital care, as Simpkins himself sued Moses Cone Hospital on the basis that it was a not-for-profit institution and therefore provided a community benefit, did not pay taxes, and therefore it was subsidized by the taxpayers. And yet black patients could not get access to that community institution. And so while at the national level, it seems that there's a significant movement to desegregate hospitals in the 1960s, on the ground in St. Louis, the story is a bit more complicated and takes much longer, particularly in the public hospital system. And so St. Louis Municipal Hospital is ostensibly desegregated in 1955 by the order of Mayor Raymond Tucker. But these hospitals shifted from a race-based admissions policy to a residency-based admissions policy. And therefore, the history of segregated housing, which I began with, in the early 20th century was then still reflected in the municipal hospital system, which still maintained de facto segregation. But there's also something else that's happening in the 1960s too, and that's that the municipal demography, the racial makeup of the city is beginning to change as folks are beginning to move away to the suburbs, right? And so by the 1960s, the City Hospital number 1, treated more black patients than it did in the past. We also have to understand that pupils in St. Mary's hospitals began to close as well. And so because of white flight, the fleeing tax base, city hospitals were both struggling to survive in the emerging market-based healthcare system. And so cities like St. Louis and Chicago and New York began to engage in health planning efforts to get out of the hospital business. Okay? And so, I actually need to go back. I apologize about that. And so the city criticized the 2 public hospitals and their unnecessary duplication of services. You see here an excerpt from one report saying that. It's interesting that now in this new kind of economy of healthcare, that this critique is levied on the part of the city, whereas in the early 20th century, these were the same kinds of critiques that anti-segregationist leaders like David Grant, like Sidney Redmond, who led the NAACP here in the 1940s, these were the critiques that they levied, right? That these hospitals were unnecessary duplication of services and they should be integrated. And so from the 1950s to the 1980s, city leaders struggled to rectify the history of racial segregation reflected in the public hospital system, facing increasing opposition from black St. Louisans. Okay. And so as the city investigated how to rectify the problem of racial segregation and the financial strain of operating both public hospitals as the tax base itself is being undermined by migration patterns, rumors began to spread throughout the black press of Homer G. Phillips Hospital impending closure. And these rumors, in the words of George Wendell, whose papers are at St. Louis University, it became a haunting refrain. And so here we see the mounting financial strain of St. Louis's public hospitals as costs escalated throughout the United States healthcare system. And Homer G. Phillips Hospital, as you can see here, and these are numbers that, I'm forgetting her name now, but a master's student actually went through the city budget to collect these numbers, and I've simply graphed them here. So the spaces are for years that we don't actually have information for. And so you can see the disparity in the funding, even though city hospitals is a little bit bigger, right? But they don't actually reach funding parity until the 1970s. But there's also a declining patient census in both city hospitals as they struggle to compete in the health marketplace, especially with private hospitals. And this was due to several factors, including expanding insurance, technological and therapeutic innovations, which are shortening patient stays. So you might think of penicillin, vaccinations, for example, but also expanding private hospitals due to federal financing. And I didn't speak about it much here today, but the 1946 Hill-Burton Hospital Modernization and Construction Act really fuels the expansion, especially of academic medical centers, like Washington University, actually. And so medical director Eugene Mitchell in the 1970s begins to respond to some of the criticism that's circulating around in the St. Louis press. And he does acknowledge that some of these reports of the hospital's physical condition were correct, that there was crumbling infrastructure and insects and other kinds of creepy crawlies that are running around the hospital. This is something that I've heard from other black St. Louisans too, who may have been admitted to the hospital in the 1960s and 1970s, that because of the history and legacy of underfunding, understaffing, right, the city itself sort of viewed the hospital as being separate and apart from, that all culminated really in the hospital's decline. It's been operating for about more than 30 years at this point. There have been some adjustments to it, but it needed more. It needed more investment, right? And I do think that both Eugene Mitchell and later Howard Philip Venable were using the press to really gin up public concern so that hopefully they could get more funding from the city of St. Louis, and they do. And so ordinary Black St. Louisans began to mobilize in the 1950s and 60s to preserve the hospital. And they argued that it was an important and necessary institution. Now, one of the questions that I would always ask is, well, why fight to preserve a formerly segregated hospital? Right? Why fight to do that if we've already desegregated hospitals at the national level? And again, they argued that the hospital was important and necessary, that it was accessible in North St. Louis. And here you see in this petition to Mayor Raymond Tucker that they're asking for more hospital care, not less. More hospital care, not less. And these ordinary Black St. Louisans, along with the ad hoc committee to save Homer G. Phillips, began to take their calls to the federal government. They take their calls particularly to the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, which is in charge of ensuring that American hospitals officially desegregate in order to receive federal funds. And again, the African American newspaper, the St. Louis Argus, has been a wonderful resource in terms of tracing the development of these local grassroots movements to preserve the institution, Homer G. Phillips. These ordinary St. Louisans were successful in petitioning the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare to investigate the city of St. Louis. And HEW actually comes into town and attempts to conduct a survey to see whether Homer G. Phillips could be converted into a private hospital. And they determined that because of the high burden of charity care in North St. Louis and the failure of DePaul Hospital in North St. Louis, that option would not work. Right? And so we return to Dick Gregory again, whose perception changes by the 1970s. He joins the fight to save Homer G. Phillips, even though it's a hospital where he had so many negative associations. And here he talks about, he's very sort of bombastic in his language, but he talks about, a waiting list being 12 years long for Black doctors to get an opportunity to train at Homer G. Phillips Hospital. And he's really making the case that the hospital is important, again, not only for patients, but also for professionals. And this movement began to coalesce and grow to save Homer G. Phillips Hospital, and later to save all public hospitals, as of course the city of St. Louis was moving to get out of the hospital business. And there were economic protests like work stoppages and strikes and boycotts, picketing also, and other forms of direct action. And here again, we have some political cartoons from the St. Louis Argus, a prominent African-American newspaper, I should say also, that was owned by the Mitchell family, Eugene Mitchell's family. And it followed the hospital issue closely for readers. And again, you see this image on the left, for example, depicting Homer G. Phillips as a strong, sturdy tree, right? That it's deeply rooted in the community, deeply rooted at the national level amongst many of the Black physicians who circulated in and through the hospital. But these efforts were ultimately unsuccessful, as we now know today. And the ad hoc committee later renamed the Campaign for Human Dignity and other labor, religious, and political organizations. Their efforts ultimately failed, right? But Homer G. Phillips closed on August 17th, 1979. And it was the last general hospital on the city's predominantly African-American north side. I'll come back to some of these images in a minute. And so I want you to listen to Dr. Mary Tillman. This is another oral history interview that I conducted. Dr. Mary Tillman succeeded Helen Nash in the Department of Pediatrics, and she describes her experiences that day.
I got in, I stopped by Children's Hospital that morning. I said, well, so if I get over there, one of the people from KMOX that rides the helicopter for traffic, he said, oh, and he said, must be something going on over at Homer Phillips. There's so many police cars over there. But by then, I was already at Homer Phillips. And I'm starting to go in, and all these, police, and I'm telling them that. I said, well, what's going on? I said, I'm trying to go to work. And, like man on United Airlines. So they drew a nightstick on me and said, for me to turn around. So then I went all around and found a space to park, and then I walked over to, into the hospital, into the other ways from where they were being policed. And by then, of course, everybody was crying and all that. But and then.
So I don't know if you could hear that, right? But she was talking about the large police presence that was present on the day that Homer G. Phillips Hospital closed. She herself was trying to get to work. Many people did not know that the hospital would be closed that day. Activists like Wale and Musa described closing day as a siege, right? Many people were arrested. But thanks to the organizing efforts of folks like Zenobia Thompson, the ad hoc committee to save Homer G. Phillips Hospital, that they immediately got the word out that the city was moving to consolidate Homer G. Phillips Hospital with City Hospital number 1 on this day. And activists showed up. And I will go here next. They constructed an impromptu barricade of hospital furniture. They sat in the street to block the movement of vehicles and patients, right? They, again, constructed an impromptu barricade of hospital furniture that you can see here. And I just think these images are so powerful, right? The amount of action and effort, coordination and communication that Black St. Louisans were engaged in to be able to argue and articulate that this hospital, beyond its history of being a segregated institution, that it still was providing important and necessary hospital services, especially free and affordable public hospital services, right? And much of Black St. Louisans' antagonism was directed toward Mayor James Conway. And here you see a people's indictment accusing the mayor of, quote, genocide, using kind of the language of the day in terms of Black Americans' larger movement to assert their human rights on an international level, right? And so James Conway was the mayor who finally made the decision to close Homer G. Phillips Hospital and consolidate it with City Hospital number 1. Okay, and even after the hospital's closure, this artwork by local St. Louis artist Spencer Thornton Banks, activists initiated a Reopen Homer G. Phillips Hospital campaign. And Spencer Thornton Banks, who I've just discovered maybe last year or so, I've had these images for a long time, but I was unsure who made them, who drew them. But they're so powerful in terms of articulating what I see, at least from the sources, of these dual visions of progress for healthcare in St. Louis. And so on the one side, you have the hospital that's closed, and on the other side, you have a hospital that's open, right? And they're on these scales of justice. I don't know if you can see that, right? So the one that's closed is weighed down, right? While the one that's open is elevated, it's raised. It's also on the right side of the image, right? And here we just have images from the last days of the hospital. You just see empty wards, empty rooms, with just a few people, including a security guard. Okay. So in 1980, Black St. Louisans largely supported Vincent Shamel, who would become the city's youngest mayor in St. Louis history, up until that point at least. And Mayor Shamel unsuccessfully led a campaign to reopen the hospital, actually giving the issue back to St. Louis voters to vote on. And I actually sat down and spoke with Mayor Shamel himself. And here's what he had to say about Homer G. Phillips.
Homer Phillips is sitting right in the middle of the Ville neighborhood. I mean, right across the street. People are living, there's a firehouse, there's St. Matthew's, there's, Soldan High School right next door. I mean, you got, it was an intimate part of an intimate neighborhood, and it would have made all the difference in the world to the well-being of that neighborhood. Let's stop a second.
Okay, all right. So I'm coming up on my timeline here, so I'll just go ahead and move fast. And I will say that, so the city of St. Louis engaged in a multi-decade-long effort to study hospitals beginning in the 1950s. There have been numerous reports, health planning efforts to really think about the allocation of health resources in the city. And you see an image here on the left from the Pesh and Smith report that ultimately leads to recommendations to James Conway that both city hospitals should be consolidated and later closed. There is a new hospital, consolidated hospital, that emerges, St. Louis Regional, that's short-lived in the 1990s. But again, activists, sort of are learning the process, and they're adopting the process and responding, right? So as the city of St. Louis was engaged in its own consultant-driven reports, the ad hoc committee to save Homer G. Phillips and all public hospitals, that later sort of transitions to become the Campaign for Human Dignity, produces its own alternative people's health plan. And here you have just two images from that health plan where they're envisioning the centrality of community, right? The ever needed role of these two public hospitals, both Homer G. Phillips as well as Max Starkloff, which was the adopted name of City Hospital #1. And here is, again, Nurse Zenobia Thompson, who is still active today. She will be at another event at Washington University on Saturday. And she's holding up that alternative people's health plan. I thank her for allowing me to read that, because I think it's such an important part of this story, right? That Black St. Louisans themselves are trying to get a seat at the table, right? And put their demands front and center to city administrators. Okay, and I just want to leave you with some final conclusions here. So, legacies of segregated medicine. And so I will conclude with a few remarks on the enduring legacy of segregated medicine. In 1966, while addressing the Medical Committee for Human Rights, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Assessed that injustices in healthcare are the most shocking and inhumane of all the forms of inequality. And yet only recently have scholars turned their attention to health and medicine to examine the broader movements to fight for equality within the United States healthcare system. And here are just some estimates taken from the American Hospital Association on what our healthcare system looks like now. And one of the things that interested me is the decline of municipal healthcare. So you see the image at the top, the decline of public hospitals and the rise of not-for-profit community institutions, the rise of health systems, right? And then we wonder, where's the place of Black Americans, right, in this new evolution of these new healthcare systems? Well, we also think about the history and legacy of segregation in medical education. So for many of you who are familiar with the statistics on Black Americans' representation in the medical profession, that the representation has not moved much, right? And you actually have scholars who have asked the question, well, if these institutions that closed in the shadow of Abraham Flexner's report, how many more Black physicians would we have? Now, this is, one can't actually know in truth, but it is an interesting question, I think, for us to think about, right? And finally, the memory and legacy of Homer G. Phillips, from Homer G. Phillips, the attorney, is still alive and active today, even if the institution itself has since been closed many decades by now. So here you have the recently replaced gravestone for both Homer G. Phillips and his wife, Ida Pearl Phillips, who died here at Barnes Hospital a few years after her husband was assassinated. His grave was forgotten for many years until in the 1990s, again, in the shadow of the closure of Homer G. Phillips Hospital, that St. Louisans, interracial coalition, actually began to recuperate the legacy of attorney Homer G. Phillips. And here on the left is an image, a beautiful image that's in the archives of St. Louis University, produced by Judge Nathan Young, who was a contemporary of Homer G. Phillips, but who lived far longer than the attorney did. And Judge Young painted this in remembrance of his colleague and friend in the 1970s. And I will conclude there. Okay. All right. Thank you so much. I'd be happy to take any questions, if anyone has, about Homer G. Phillips, about the history of racial segregation.
Yeah, we do have questions. We just still have a Zoom audience, so if any of you in the in-person audience would like to ask a question, Sarah here is going to bring you a microphone if you just want to raise your hand.
Looks like there's one back there.
Thank you so much. This was phenomenal, so really appreciate all your work. Just wondering if you found any more, you said publicly assassinated, that Homer G. Phillips was publicly assassinated, and I knew that he was killed before the hospital was built, but I didn't know that it was public, and you know, I'm often asked why, and we make assumptions about his activism around this, but do you have any evidence to sort of support that theory?
Yeah, Homer G. Phillips Hospital was assassinated on a street corner. So that's what I'm referring to when I say publicly assassinated. Now, the newspapers that surround his death also use that language, and it was sort of unclear. And forgive me, if I can't see you, I'm partially sighted. But it's unclear, or at least at the time when he was murdered, you know, what was it, right? Was it sort of a political assassination? Was it, you know, did it have anything to do with his law practice? And there was an article published in Ebony, both in the 1950s and the 1970s, that I think does the best job of actually recounting that day when Phillips was murdered in 1931. It seems to me, from what I've seen in newspapers, but also in other writing about Homer G. Phillips, is that he was killed by disgruntled clients who did not want to pay his fee, and so he withheld some payments that he was supposed to give them. And two young African-American men were witnessed shooting him as he was waiting on the streetcar. Now, those two men were ultimately acquitted of all charges for a variety of reasons. I'll say that I do have the police report from this incident, from his murder. And there, it seems pretty clear that there may have been some maybe some machinations behind the scenes. There were some people who were jealous of Homer G and his sort of rising star. So he was killed publicly. We know who did it, but in terms of why and maybe some of the undergirding reasons beyond this payment, I think that's still kind of up for speculation. I mean, really. I mean, and as much as I've tried to look into the life of Homer G. Phillips, the documentary evidence is really scant. He didn't leave much for us. I think he was killed before he had made proper arrangements and a will. His wife died a few years later of pneumonia. He didn't have any children, as far as I'm aware, and so the story really kind of stops there. But from the police report, I've seen that even the witness, Abner Parker, who reported these men, didn't show up to court, and then a year later is showing up to the police asking for a license to be a private investigator, and there was a warrant out for his arrest. Right. So again, in terms of why he didn't show up, we don't actually know. Yeah. Thank you. It's a great question.
There was a question from the Zoom audience. Comment first, just about some of the desegregation efforts here on our own medical center. There was a number of counts where our own faculty members and interns and residents went rogue, so to speak, against our own policies, including residents taking it upon themselves to integrate wards.
Yes.
Notably, our own library's namesake, Dr. Bernard Becker, integrated the ophthalmology clinics in McMillan. And the question is, are you aware of other instances of that, either in other St. Louis hospitals or elsewhere, where faculty, interns, residents, et cetera, went against the policies and were part of the process of desegregation?
That, again, is a wonderful question. I will say that in my work with Johns Hopkins, the Johns Hopkins University, as well as the Johns Hopkins Hospital, I was engaging in a project to look into the history of racial segregation in those hospitals. I'm still working on a project that's going to be multiple years coming. But we see this, actually, in the case of Dr. Dick Reynolds. And there is, for this individual, I'll be happy to provide this magazine article that was featured in the Johns Hopkins magazine, where Dick Reynolds sort of recounted this story. He was a resident at the time, and recounted a story of having a overflowing segregated ward. And there were still African American patients who were coming into the Johns Hopkins Hospital. And he being sort of a resident, calls up the chief resident, who Dr. Wilbur Matheson, who recently has actually passed away, to see if it would be okay to admit black patients to the non-black wards. And they both decide, both the assistant resident, the chief resident, to do this. And there's no reaction. No reaction from hospital administrators. And in fact, the practices soon change, right? And this is what I've often found when it comes to desegregation, particularly at predominantly white institutions that had segregated wards or segregated bathrooms, which is that by the 1950s, you see the cracks in the system, but they're often unstated, right? So it just takes an intrepid, physician or a nurse to make the call and to do it, and people realize that no one is going crazy, right? And soon enough, those policies soon change, and we do see that again at Hopkins, where soon after the segregated bathrooms, they began to take those signs down and paint them. Patients are, admitted to various wards, again, often without any fanfare. So when I'm trying to look for a moment, right, when we think about schools, we think about these moments where, Black Americans are forcibly integrating. But in the case of hospitals, that's not what I've seen largely. It's been this kind of just crumbling of the system internally with very little recognition and at least in the cases that I've seen, not much pushback by this point. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk, your talk and your work. I'm over
There
here.
we go. Thank you.
I'm looking forward to your book. I'm sure many of us are. And I just want to ask you, I'm an historical sociologist. Historians will read this, social scientists will look forward to it, people who study social movements, those sorts of things. I would like to hear what your thoughts on how perhaps you're thinking about the contribution your work makes to education and medical and public health contexts. Do you have some thoughts on how, academic medicine, medical schools, public health schools will potentially benefit from this work?
That's a wonderful question, and it's one that I think my perspective has been evolving, particularly in light of our recent experiences with COVID-19. I was at the University of Pennsylvania when that happened, and I realized that, well, I didn't realize. Students were coming to me and asking about, how can we learn more about the history of race and racial categories? How can we learn more about the history of racial inequality? Can we find examples of models who we can find encouragement by or empowerment by, right? And so I hope that my work will help us to, again, understand and know that the history of racial segregation, right, has played a significant role in how medical education itself has developed. It's played a critical role in the development and spread in the geography of our institutions, right? And this is a point that the health management scholar David Barton Smith makes in his book, The Power to Heal, which is about the medical civil rights movement that's been really influential in my own work. And I think once we have that understanding, right, and that, sort of, again, a very successful medical civil rights movement at the national level, passes policy, is effective in the court system, right? But that, some of the underlying questions, some of the legacies of the institutional networks, right, that were formed in the early 20th century in the context of Jim Crow, that some of that has not gone away, right? And so if we're really going to be serious about promoting equality, I think we have to really take a serious look at some of the foundations upon which everything else has been built across the 20th century into the 21st, right? And so that's what I hope that students will take away from my work, which is that we can envision a new way to educate doctors. That, maybe a 4-year curriculum might not work for everybody, right? That, kind of the way that we sort of, admit students might not be the best way for us to produce the kinds of doctors that we want to see in the world, right? That there are other alternatives out there, that we just have to envision what they are. But first we have to understand how the current system that we're still deeply entrenched in developed in this moment, right, where racial inequality was the law of the land, really. I hope that answered your question. Yeah.
I'm going to walk over to this
Oh.
microphone, as I'm not sure if that one's, I think it's working for Zoom, but
Oh,
not,
okay.
not for the in-person audience. As we're over time, I am going to close out at least the virtual portion of the Q&A, so we can, thank you, Dr. Sanford, for your presentation and for being here. For those of you that want to stay for the in-person audience, we can either keep it going here. I actually need to go over to the library to welcome the guests coming to our open house for the new exhibit. So if you want to join us over there, we can keep asking questions to Dr. Sanford. There's food and drinks up there. But for at least the virtual portion, I'm going to close it out here. Thank you again.